At 25 years old, Hezekiah ascended the throne of Judah, carrying a burden few could bear, leading a nation sunk in idolatry, fear, and spiritual corruption. His father, King Ahaz, had locked the temple doors, desecrated the sacred altars, and completely surrendered to foreign gods. Judah was in darkness, directionless, like a city lost in the desert without a compass or stars. And it was precisely in this chaotic scenario that God chose Hezekiah. A young man who could have followed his father's footsteps, but decided to tread an opposite path. Like a lighthouse amidst the storm, Hezekiah began to shine. He didn't wait for the right moment, nor did he gather a council to assess the risks. In the first month of the first year of his reign, he made a decision that would change everything: to open the doors of the Lord's temple and restore true worship. This wasn't just a political or religious act. It was an act of rebellion against the sin that had reigned for years in Judah. Imagine the impact of this gesture on a population accustomed to pagan altars on every corner, sacrifices to fertility gods, and the constant fear of neighboring powers. Hezekiah was like a gardener who, inheriting a field full of weeds, decided to plant life where there was only death before. But Hezekiah's courage didn't come from nowhere. He had something few kings possessed: a heart fully devoted to God. While the people still hesitated between two masters, he had already made his choice. He knew faithfulness would have a price, and he was willing to pay it. The Levites and priests, previously scattered and discouraged, began to be gathered. The temple, covered in dust and contempt, would be cleansed, consecrated, and returned to its true purpose. Hezekiah didn't just want to rule a people, he wanted to restore a covenant. And so began the silent revolution of a king who dared to say no to the tradition of idolatry and yes to God's call. A new era was dawning in Judah, and it all started with the simple opening of a door. How many would have the courage to shake the foundations of a people accustomed to idolatry? How many would dare to touch the altars erected by generations, dismantle the sacred poles, and declare war on institutionalized sin? Hezekiah did exactly that. His religious reform wasn't just a symbolic cleansing. It was a complete demolition of everything that distanced Judah from God. He ordered the destruction of pagan altars, the cutting down of Asherah poles, and the tearing down of the high places where foreign gods were worshipped. Furthermore, he didn't even spare what many considered a sacred relic: the bronze serpent made by Moses, which had become an object of worship, was shattered by Hezekiah's direct order. For him, anything that took God's place needed to be removed, even if it had a legitimate past. This attitude reveals something profound about his character. Hezekiah understood that restoration isn't simply returning to what was before, but aligning everything with God's original purpose. The temple, now clean and consecrated, once again became the center of worship. The priests resumed their duties, the Levites returned to singing, and the sacrifices were reintroduced according to the law of Moses. The reform wasn't restricted to Jerusalem. He sent messengers throughout the kingdom and even into the territory of the former kingdom of Israel, which had already been conquered by Assyria, inviting the remnant to return to the Lord. It was as if Hezekiah was shouting across the land, "There is still time. Return to the God who never abandoned you. You didn't arrive here by chance. God has a powerful word for you today. Comment, 'I trust in you, Lord,' and subscribe to our channel. Don't let it pass. God wants to touch your life now." Of course, there was resistance. Many mocked, others ignored, but a multitude answered the call. The heart of the people began to rekindle. The nearly extinguished flame of faith was reignited at every purified altar, in every song that echoed through the restored temple. Hezekiah wasn't just reforming a religion. He was rebuilding the identity of a people, a king who wasn't afraid to break down what was wrong to build up what was right. Judah began to remember who they were, and more importantly, whose they were. After purifying the temple and removing the idols, Hezekiah knew something essential was still missing, reconnecting the people with their roots, rekindling the collective memory of where they came from and who the God was that had delivered them. And so, he decided to do something audacious, celebrate the Passover as hadn't been seen in centuries. But there was a problem. The priests were still purifying themselves, and the people weren't ready at the traditional time. The festival, normally held in the first month, was moved to the second. To some, this might have seemed an affront to tradition, but for Hezekiah, it was a chance to restore the heart before following the ritual. Invitations were sent throughout Judah, and even to the remaining tribes in the territory of the former kingdom of Israel. Many refused. Some mocked, but others responded, coming from Ephraim, Manasseh, and Issachar, breaking down old divisions and uniting with the people of Judah. It was as if the fragments of a shattered nation were gathering again around an altar. When the Passover was finally celebrated, it wasn't just a ceremony, it was a rebirth. The streets of Jerusalem filled with families bringing lambs. The Levites sang songs with tears in their eyes, and the smoke of the sacrifices rose to the heavens as a symbol of reconciliation. The people didn't want it to end. After the mandatory 7 days, they spontaneously decided to extend the festival for another 7. A collective joy swept through the city, something rare, intense, almost palpable. It was more than a celebration. It was the soul of Judah breathing again. Hezekiah walked among the people with a full heart. He wasn't just their king. He was someone who had guided them back to the God who never abandoned them. At the end of the celebration, everyone returned home carrying not only food and memories, but a renewed faith and a sense of belonging that had long disappeared. That moment marked a watershed. The covenant had been restored. The people were ready, and the challenges that would soon come would put this faith to the test. If you are enjoying this story, don't forget to leave your like on this video. God will bless you greatly. The atmosphere of spiritual restoration still lingered over Judah when a new wind began to blow. A heavy wind coming from the north, laden with dust, fear, and oppression. It was Assyria, the most feared empire of the time, advancing like an avalanche upon the nations. One by one, neighboring kingdoms fell before the overwhelming power of Sennacherib, a king who believed himself invincible. Hezekiah, now experienced, knew the challenge was inevitable. Assyria had already destroyed the northern kingdom, Israel, and was now marching towards Judah. But Hezekiah was not intimidated. Instead of surrendering, he began to prepare the city of Jerusalem like someone preparing for a long night of storm. He strengthened the walls, built towers, reorganized the army, and made a brilliant strategic decision. He diverted the city's main water source by constructing the so-called Siloam Tunnel, ensuring supply during a potential siege. But Hezekiah knew that no military strategy would suffice if God was not with them. So he gathered the people and spoke firmly. Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of the king of Assyria. With him is only the arm of flesh, but with us is the Lord our God to help us and to fight our battles. These words weren't just rhetoric, they were conviction. Sennacherib, however, hadn't counted on a king who would resist with faith. He tried to conquer through fear. He sent messengers with letters full of insults and threats, mocking the God of Israel and claiming that no nation had withstood his army. It was a war of nerves, a psychological battle before the swords even clashed. The siege was set. Jerusalem, small and surrounded, looked to the heavens for answers. The Assyrian army positioned itself like a huge shadow about to swallow everything. But Hezekiah did not yield, not to human power, nor to pressure. He knew this fight wasn't just political or territorial, it was spiritual, and in that arena, Judah had already begun to win. When the Assyrian messengers delivered Sennacherib's letter, the mood in Jerusalem grew heavy. Silence fell over the streets. The scroll, sealed with the emblem of the most feared empire of the era, carried not just words, but arrogance, contempt, and blasphemy. The content was clear: surrender or be destroyed like all the others. Hezekiah took that letter in his hands and felt the weight of every sentence. The insults weren't just against him, but against the very God of Israel. No other king would have done what Hezekiah did next. He didn't immediately summon his generals or seek political alliances. He went up to the temple, entered the presence of the Lord, and spread the letter out before God, as if saying, "This isn't just about me, it's about you." There, alone before the altar, Hezekiah prayed. But it wasn't a desperate prayer filled with demands. He acknowledged who God was. "O Lord, God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth." Then he opened his heart. "It is true, Lord, that the Assyrian kings have laid waste these nations. But now, Lord our God, deliver us, so that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, Lord, are God." The prayer wasn't a religious act. It was an act of total surrender. While the enemy displayed its strength outside the city gates, Hezekiah knelt before an invisible throne, trusting in the eternal arm. He didn't ask for glory. He didn't ask for vengeance. He didn't negotiate. He simply asked that God defend his own name. That scene in the temple was one of the most powerful in Judah's history. A king without swords in his hands, without shields, only with faith. The sound of the Assyrian army outside contrasted with the sacred silence of the prayer ascending to heaven, and heaven answered. The prophet Isaiah was immediately sent to Hezekiah with a clear message. God had heard. The prayer had pierced the walls, broken through the clouds, and reached the heavenly throne. Sennacherib's pride would not go unpunished, and the fate of that threat was already sealed, not by human armies, but by the divine intervention that would soon be revealed. The city was still under tension, the gates closed, the walls watched day and night. But while the Assyrian army moved arrogantly outside, another force began to act in the unseen realm. God had heard Hezekiah's prayer, and in response, he raised the voice of a man already known in Judah, the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah was no ordinary man. He was a messenger who carried the weight of divine truth in every word. And at that critical moment, his words came without doubt or ambiguity. They were direct, sharp, like an unsheathed sword. He came to the king and said, "Thus says the Lord, do not be afraid because of the words you have heard. I myself will put a spirit in him so that he will hear a rumor and return to his own land, and there I will cause him to fall by the sword." The promise wasn't just of protection. God was declaring war against Sennacherib's pride. The tone of the message was personal. The Lord wasn't just defending Jerusalem, he was defending his own name. The king of Assyria had insulted the living God, and that would not go unanswered. Isaiah continued his prophecy, describing in detail the end of Assyrian arrogance. He said that Sennacherib would not enter Jerusalem, nor shoot an arrow there, nor build siege ramps against its walls. The army that came like an unbeatable monster would be prevented from even touching the stones of the holy city. Hezekiah heard this with a heart at peace. The same God who guided Israel in the desert now protected the city with his own arms. The message wasn't just for Hezekiah, it was for all the people. A reminder that the God of Judah was not like the gods of the conquered nations. He was living, present, attentive. The people who had united at Passover and now trembled before the enemy began to breathe with relief again. There was hope, and that hope came from above. God was in control. Isaiah's words echoed like thunder over the walls of Jerusalem. And while the Assyrian soldiers sharpened their spears, heaven prepared its response, an answer no one expected, but one that would change the course of history on that silent night. Night fell over Jerusalem with a heavy silence, as if even the wind held its breath for what was about to happen. Outside the walls, the Assyrian tents covered the valley like a dark sea. 185,000 soldiers, elite warriors, were ready to destroy what they deemed just another weak city in their path of conquest. But that dawn, the enemy camp would not be touched by human swords. It would be visited by something far greater. The Bible recounts it directly and impressively. That night, the angel of the Lord went out and struck down all the soldiers in the Assyrian camp. A single divine move was enough to break the backbone of the most feared empire of the time. There was no battle, no war cry. There was only the silent judgment of God. At dawn, the few survivors rose to see an unimaginable scene. Bodies everywhere, torn tents, fallen banners. The army that prided itself on invincibility now lay silent before the God they had mocked. Sennacherib, who had insulted the Lord with arrogant words, had to beat a retreat, humiliated, powerless. He returned to Nineveh, his capital, without glory and without honor. What happened that night echoed among the nations. Jerusalem, which should have been easily taken, remained standing, protected not by walls or swords, but by the arm of the Lord. The people who had feared being crushed now saw clearly that God fought for them. Hezekiah didn't need to lift a finger on the battlefield. His weapon was faith. His strength came from prayer. Later, Sennacherib himself met his end in a tragic and symbolic way. He was killed by his own sons while worshipping in the temple of his God, an ironic end for one who had challenged the true God. The divine intervention wasn't just a military victory, it was a declaration. The Lord of Judah was not an abstract idea or a voiceless statue. He was real, present, sovereign, and when he decides to act, no empire, however strong it may seem, can resist. The city was saved, the people preserved, and faith once again was confirmed by direct action from heaven. The time of peace had finally arrived in Judah. The enemies had been defeated, Jerusalem remained secure, and the people's faith was stronger than ever. But just when everything seemed calm, a new battle arose, and this time it wouldn't come from outside the walls. It would spring from within the king's own body. Hezekiah became gravely ill. The illness was not ordinary. His condition worsened rapidly, and even with the kingdom's stability, the king's health was an urgent matter. It was in this context that Isaiah returned to the palace, but now with a message that cut like a blade. "Set your house in order, for you shall die, you shall not recover." There were no ambiguities. The prophet brought no hope, only a sentence. Hezekiah heard those words and turned his face to the wall. There, in silence, without the presence of crowds or leaders, he wept. But his weeping was not empty despair. It was a plea. He prayed again, as he had done before Sennacherib's letter. He reminded God of his faithfulness, his devotion, his wholehearted integrity before him. And then, before Isaiah had even left the palace courtyards, God spoke. "Go back and tell Hezekiah, I have heard your prayer and seen your tears. I will add 15 years to your life." The sentence had been reversed. Life would be prolonged, not by medicine or human intervention, but by divine mercy. And as a sign of this promise, God would do something extraordinary. The shadow on the stairway of Ahaz would go back 10 steps. The phenomenon occurred. The daylight, obeying the Creator's command, turned back time before everyone's eyes. It wasn't just an astronomical sign. It was a clear message that God, who commands time and life, had once again heard the cry of his servant. Hezekiah, restored, returned to rule with a new sense of fragility and gratitude. He had conquered external enemies, but now he understood that even the quietest internal battles were won in the same place, in the presence of God. The news of Hezekiah's healing and the wonder of the sun moving backward traveled to distant lands with the speed of legend. It wasn't just any miracle. It was something that made the kings of the East raise their eyebrows. And so, sometime later, messengers from Babylon arrived in Jerusalem, bringing gifts and greetings to the king who had defied death and had time reversed in his favor. Hezekiah received them cordially, but what should have been just a diplomatic visit became a stage for a subtle and profound mistake. He opened the doors to his treasuries, showed them silver, gold, spices, weapons, everything in the palace and the royal storehouses. He showed too much, not just riches, but his heart. The Bible does not omit what happened there. Hezekiah acted out of vanity. Instead of glorifying God for the miracles that had sustained him, he seized the moment to display his achievements, victories, and abundance as if they were solely the fruit of his administration and power. Pride, silent as a shadow, found an opening in the soul of a man who had knelt so many times in humility. Soon after the visit, Isaiah sought him out. Firmly, he asked what the foreigners had seen. When he learned that everything had been revealed, the prophet delivered a new word, this time a somber one. The time will surely come when everything in your palace will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left. And worse, even Hezekiah's sons would be taken away and would serve as eunuchs in the palace of that distant empire. That was a bitter turn. Despite so many honorable deeds, Hezekiah fell where many strong men stumble, in the glare of his own success. His response to the prophecy was resigned. He acknowledged that, at least during his lifetime, there would be peace. But the forecast left a taste of warning. When pride takes the place of reverence, even the most righteous can open dangerous doors. The glory that once rose like incense before God had now slipped through the fingers of an admired king. The mistake was brief, but its consequences would echo for generations. Hezekiah ended his journey, reminding everyone that even the great must remain vigilant against their own vanity. Hezekiah's name was marked among the kings of Judah as one of the most upright and courageous. He wasn't remembered for great territorial conquests or luxurious monuments. His legacy was spiritual, moral, and eternal. He was the king who reopened the temple doors when everyone had forgotten God. The man who challenged the greatest empire of his time with bended knees and saw heaven move in his defense. During his 29 years of reign, Judah experienced a time of renewal unseen since the days of David. Worship of the Lord was restored, the word was read again, and the presence of God, which had departed due to idolatry, returned to the center of the people's lives. Hezekiah prepared the priests, reorganized the Levitical service, reintroduced biblical feasts, and above all, led by example. But his legacy also bears human marks. His mistake before the Babylonians showed that even the most faithful can fail when carried away by pride. This episode became a silent warning to subsequent generations. All power and glory belong to the Lord, and diverting them to oneself can be costly. Still, the overall testimony of Hezekiah is one of faithfulness. The biblical author himself states that there was no king like him among all the kings of Judah, either before him or after him. This declaration wasn't due to his administrative works or military capability, but because of a rare characteristic. Hezekiah trusted in the Lord, the God of Israel, with all his heart. His story doesn't end in absolute glory, but neither does it end in tragedy. He leaves behind an example of practical faith, of leadership sensitive to God's voice, and of courage in the face of overwhelming challenges. Judah, even though it would face difficult times in the future, would never be the same after Hezekiah's reign. His name became a constant reminder that it is possible to transform a generation with firm decisions, godly attitudes, and a surrendered life. Hezekiah was not perfect, but he was profoundly faithful, and that made all the difference in the history of God's people. If you like biblical stories like this one about Hezekiah, I invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos. Leave your like and share this video with a friend. May God bless you.